Hello everyone, and welcome to the Buyuden Japanese History channel. Now, if you clicked on this video, I think you're probably already aware of what we're here to do today, which is to talk about the history of this delicious little food here, sushi. Obviously, I've got the supermarket budget version here because I'm not exactly rolling in that YouTube money just yet, but as we're going to see today, sushi comes in a lot of different shapes, sizes, and price ranges, and always has. Now, I think that if you asked just about anyone on this planet to name 3 things they associate most strongly with Japan, I'm guessing that just about everyone would put sushi on that list, along with probably anime and, I don't know, shunga. But for a food that's so world famous, I think its origin and evolution are surprisingly unknown to most of us average sushi eaters. On the one hand, sushi is regarded as this very traditional Japanese cuisine that's been eaten since well before modern times. But at the same time, I think most of us are also aware on some level that Sengoku-era samurai were not sitting around in their mountain forts eating spicy dragon rolls. Sushi is a surprisingly enigmatic and hard to pin down food that's gone through quite a number of twists and turns over its long history, with its original form hardly even resembling the food that the denizens of Edo were enjoying during the 1800s, let alone the wild creations that you might run into nowadays at some cool new Asian fusion restaurant. Anyway, the question of sushi's origin has been on my mind lately, so rather than just scanning through the Wikipedia article like a normal person, I instead made the financially questionable decision to purchase a couple of actual books on the subject, and with their help, I put together this little primer on the history of sushi. Let's check it out. Roughly 1300 years ago, in the period of Japanese history known as the Nara period, Japanese people were already eating what is the ancestor of modern sushi, a food called narezushi. Narezushi is made by taking salt-cured fish and placing it in a container together with rice, weighing its lid down with a heavy stone, and leaving it to ferment over a period of several months. The nare in its name means ripening or acclimating, and here it is referring to this fermentation process, which not only significantly changed the fish's flavor palette, but also imparted it with a substantially longer shelf life. The narezushi concept did not originate in Japan, but rather is thought to have its roots in ancient fish preservation methods practiced on the Asian continent. The pioneering culinary historian Shinoda Osamu theorized that it was developed by mountain-dwelling peoples in Southeast Asia, people for whom having a constant supply of fresh fish was not an option. But the more recent theory of anthropologist Shigeo Miyao that it actually developed among the Asian mainland's rice-growing agricultural societies has come to be more widely accepted. Today, it seems clear that the history of sushi is closely linked with the history of rice cultivation, and that the food itself, like so many other things, made its way to Japan through contact with China. Some of the earliest mentions of sushi in Japanese historical records are in early Nara period tax documents stored in the ancient Shosoin repository, where the documents for the provinces of Owari and Tajima both contain this somewhat old-school character for sushi. Another older character for sushi, this, has been found on a similarly dated wooden slab called a mokkan, unearthed at the former capital of Heijōkyō. That same character also appears in the Yoro Law Code of 718, and we can thus assume that it likely appeared in that code's predecessor in Japan's first full Chinese-style Ritsuryo Law Code, the Taiho Code. What all this practically means is essentially that by the time Japan's government was beginning to keep written records, sushi, in its early forms, already existed on the archipelago. The 2 different characters we see used here to express the word sushi originally possessed 2 slightly different meanings in ancient China, with the former referring to salted fermented fish, and the latter denoting any sort of pickled food produced using salt and rice, the rice simply being an ingredient in the fermentation process rather than an element that was consumed. However, by the time the 2 characters made it to Japan, it seems they had come to be used interchangeably, as they are described as synonyms in the Heian period guidebook for the Ritsuryo Law Code, the Ryou no Gige. Japanese sushi of this era was basically a combination of the meanings originally held by these 2 characters, raw fish which had been pickled and fermented by means of salt and rice. There is also a third way of writing sushi, the one which is probably the most prominently used in the modern world. But this one is simply a pair of auspicious characters of unrelated meaning that happen to be read as su and shi, respectively, and did not come to be used until the Edo period. Regarding the spoken word sushi, the influential Edo period politician Arai Hakuseki wrote in a dictionary of the Japanese language which he authored in 1717 that the word sushi originated from the Japanese word for sour, with the su sound being the same one which we see in the modern Japanese word suppai, and referring to the sour taste of the fermented fish. As mentioned a moment ago, narezushi makes its debut in the Japanese historical record in Nara period tax documents, and this is because, in those days, it was sent to the imperial court as a form of tax. Under the law established by the Yoro Ritsuryo Code of 718 CE, all adult males in the country were required to pay a number of different kinds of tax to the central government, including rice, physical labor, and military service. One of the taxes they paid was called cho, and it was typically paid in cloth, but it could alternatively be paid in other specialty goods, and one of these was sushi. Specifically, we have evidence that the imperial court received tax payments of sushi made from things such as abalone, mussels, crucian carp, sea bream, bonito, and gizzard shad, and several of these continue to be used in sushi today. In the Heian period, Japan's 400-year-long age of high classical antiquity which followed the Nara period, details regarding sushi consumption come down to us in the form of the Engishiki, a document drawn up in the early part of the period to explain the finer points of the Ritsuryo law code. Within the Engishiki, references are made to many of the same kinds of sushi that we saw in the Nara period, but new types of fish such as trout and salmon also make their debut, and we even see mention of sushi made from wild boar and deer meat, showing us that ancient sushi was not specifically limited to seafood. The fermentation process for narezushi was a lengthy one, typically requiring multiple months, and as a result, the rice used in the process would be reduced to something of a mushy paste by the time it was ready. For this reason, the rice was not actually eaten, rather being scraped off and discarded as nothing more than a byproduct of the sushi's creation. Sushi actually makes a couple of appearances in the 12th century book of tales known as the Konjaku Monogatari-shu, which gives us a bit of a window into what the sushi of this long ago era was like. In one of the tales, it is mentioned as being eaten as a side dish to rice, which is important because it supports the hypothesis that ancient Japanese did not eat the rice which had been used in the actual process of fermenting the sushi, instead pairing the finished fish with a new side of freshly prepared rice. Another rather disgusting tale from the book describes a sushi street vendor getting dead drunk and losing her lunch, so to speak, into her pail of sushi, and then simply mixing it around and continuing to do business. This story seems to have been posed as a warning to its readers not to eat food that they hadn't personally seen prepared, but it does unintentionally illustrate the fact that Heian period sushi was such a tart and pungent dish that even a little bit of added stomach acid wouldn't necessarily ruin its overall flavor palette. As previously mentioned, sushi is thought to have originated as a method of preserving fish, so one could say that its unique fermented flavor was simply a side effect of the preservation process rather than a desired outcome. However, in Heian period documents, sushi is mentioned as being sent to the imperial capital from other parts of the country along with salted fish, and if preservation was the sole goal, one would think just one or the other would have sufficed. We are therefore led to the conclusion that the aristocrats of Heian-kyo likely enjoyed sushi for its unique flavor as much as for its practicality as a long-lasting food, even to the point that they were willing to waste large amounts of rice to produce it. This ancient style of sushi, believe it or not, has not completely gone extinct from Japan, with one rather famous extant example of it being Shiga Prefecture's funazushi, made from crucian carp. The fish is caught at Lake Biwa in the spring, but not actually eaten until New Year's time, meaning that it takes the better part of a year to produce, and if stored properly can apparently last for years after that, a characteristic directly linking it with sushi's ancient continental roots as a fish preservation method. After the fish is caught, its scales and guts are removed and it is stuffed to the gills, pun intended, with salt, whereupon it is placed into a wooden pail, compressed with a heavy stone weight, and left to sit for about 3 months. When the height of summer rolls around, the fish is removed from the pail and the salt covering it is mostly rinsed away, and in its place the fish is newly stuffed and covered with rice before being returned to the pail. Once again, the pail's lid is weighed down with a heavy stone to compress the fish and rice within, and it is left in a cool place so that its contents can slowly ferment for the next several months. At New Year's time, the carp is at last ready to be eaten, and just like in ancient times, the rice covering it is thoroughly scraped away, and only the fish itself is served. While I have never had the pleasure of eating funazushi personally, those who have tasted it often describe its flavor as being surprisingly similar to cheese, a phenomenon perhaps partially related to the carp being caught during its spawning season and thus fermented while still bearing its eggs. Interestingly, funazushi was on the menu at a decadent banquet in 1582 which the legendary daimyo and conqueror Oda Nobunaga threw at Azuchi Castle for his then subordinate, the future founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, Tokugawa Ieyasu. The man whom Nobunaga entrusted with organizing this banquet was none other than Akechi Mitsuhide, another of his trusted vassals and the man who would betray him and bring about his death in the infamous Honnoji incident just a month later. Mitsuhide was dismissed from his organization duties midway through the multi-day banquet for allegedly failing to keep a shipment of fish from spoiling, and the humiliation of this dismissal has sometimes been brought up as a possible cause for his betrayal shortly thereafter. Going a bit further into the realm of conspiracy theories, it has also been posited that the spoiled fish in question was actually the funazushi on the menu, and that Nobunaga just mistook it as being spoiled thanks to its state of intense fermentation. As I said, this is a conspiracy theory within a conspiracy theory, but it is fun to imagine that the most feared conqueror in Japanese history may have lost his life thanks to his ignorance of old-school sushi. If Nobunaga, who lived at the very end of Japan's medieval period, did indeed mistake the ancient-style funazushi for being just another batch of rotten fish, it is perhaps not too surprising, as sushi experienced some significant changes during the Middle Ages. While pre-medieval and early medieval Japanese records involving sushi are on the somewhat scant side, once we enter the Muromachi period, which lasted from the mid-1300s to the late 1500s, the number of records begin to notably increase. One of these is the diary of Ninagawa Chikamoto, the deputy head of the Mandokoro office of the Muromachi shogunate. In his diary, written in the late 1400s, we see an early mention of the style of sushi that would go on to largely replace ancient narezushi, a new style called namanare. Namanare essentially followed the same production process as sushi of prior centuries, but the fermentation process was shortened so that the sushi could be consumed sooner. As a result, the sushi still retained a degree of its fermented sourness, but it was significantly more raw tasting than traditional narezushi. Hence the word nama in its name, which can refer to anything from rawness to freshness to half-acidness in Japanese. According to the Nippojisho, a Japanese-Portuguese dictionary compiled by Jesuit missionaries to Japan around the year 1600, namanare, here referred to as namanari, was a type of pickled, preserved fish which had not been given adequate time to finish fermenting. Early mentions of namanare in the historical record, such as the administrative diary of the Yamashina family of aristocrats and the aforementioned diary of Ninagawa Chikamoto, list sushi as a gift or tribute item, which is fairly consistent with its character as a form of tax payment during more ancient times. In addition to the fermentation process being shortened in namanare, one of its other major characteristics is that, for the first time, the rice in which the fish was fermented was eaten alongside it. It is hard to say exactly what sparked this change, but a likely factor was the significant advance in agricultural production capacity that took place during the Muromachi period, thanks to new developments in irrigation and fertilizer technology and the advent of double cropping rice and wheat. With this increased ability to produce food, the country's common people began to incorporate rice more into their diets in place of the various types of millet which they had subsisted off in earlier ages, and it is possible that their adversity to wasting food could have been a factor in the development of a type of sushi in which rice was not discarded. This was probably the sushi that Oda Nobunaga would have been more familiar with, as his home province of Owari was famous for a style of namanare made from ayu or sweet fish by local cormorant fishermen. After his clan fell from power and Owari came into the possession of the Tokugawa, this sushi was sponsored by the shogunal government and became a regular item of tribute to the Tokugawa shoguns, along with many other traditional styles of sushi. However, with the end of the Middle Ages and the advent of this period of Tokugawa rule, known as the Edo period, sushi would begin to transform at a faster rate than ever before, and it wouldn't be long before the namanare of the Muromachi period was beginning to look just as old-fashioned as the sushi of ancient times. The invention of namanare had kicked off a trend in Japan's culinary culture to gradually compress sushi's fermentation period into a shorter and shorter window of time. And by the early Edo period, various new techniques had come to be employed to maintain its tart and acidic flavor palette, even without significantly long fermentation. Some of these techniques relied on adding new ingredients that would accelerate the fermentation process, specifically alcohol, sakekasu, aka the lees left over after producing rice wine, and koji, steamed rice which has had a specific type of mold spore cultivated into it and is a key ingredient in the production of rice wine. Another technique, and one which would have more far-reaching effects on sushi's eventual destiny, was the addition of vinegar as a way of simply artificially replacing the sourish flavor of heavily fermented sushi. One recipe from 1668's Ryouichi Iino actually suggests adding alcohol and vinegar if one is planning to ferment sushi for just a couple of days prior to eating, but to skip the vinegar and only add alcohol if one intends to go for a more conservative 5-day or so fermentation period. These new types of namanare, which employed creative workarounds to get the sushi out onto the dinner table faster, were broadly referred to with the term haya-zushi, literally fast sushi. But over the years, this term came to be used exclusively in reference to sushi made with vinegar, as the alcohol-related methods eventually dropped out of the mainstream. Early on, haya-zushi seems to have split into two main varieties. One called sugata-zushi, or form sushi, in which a whole fish was gutted, stuffed with rice, and pressed while still retaining the basic appearance of a living fish, and another called hako-zushi, or box sushi, where the fish was sliced into smaller pieces and these pieces were pressed together with rice in a container. These two varieties, form sushi and box sushi, are worth remembering because not only are they still around today, but most other modern sushi can also be traced back to either one of the two. During the latter half of the 17th century, we begin to see the first sushi shops popping up in the city of Edo. In a guidebook on the city written in 1687, two sushi shops, Omiya and Surugaya, are mentioned as operating in the Nihonbashi neighborhood, both of them selling fairly traditional styles in narezushi and something called ii-zushi, a type of sushi where rice fermented with koji was the centerpiece of the dish. It would take another half-century or so, but by the mid-1700s, haya-zushi was also beginning to appear on sushi shop menus. According to a late 18th century book on Edo culture and lifestyle, narezushi had been the prominent style of sushi available at most shops roughly until the 1730s and 40s. But from the 1750s onward, cafe-style restaurants began serving haya-zushi as a snack to be eaten with drinks, and not long after, other shops began selling it packaged as a gift. One cookbook published around the year 1800 even goes so far as to include a recipe for namanare-style mackerel sushi, with a footnote cautioning readers that it's not to everyone's liking and they ought to use discretion when serving it, hinting that namanare was seriously falling out of fashion in favor of the more hip and now haya-zushi by this point in history. By the late 1700s, the haya-zushi served by some of the most successful shops had progressed into being regarded as local delicacies, topping food lists in books such as 1777's Edo Meibutsu, a book aggregating Edo's most famous products in a variety of categories. Haya-zushi was not only limited to cafes and gift shops, however, as during roughly the same period, outdoor food stalls specializing in the dish are also recorded as having begun to appear. The stalls would pop up in the evening along a populous main road called Toricho, which ran through the Nihonbashi area, and they would sell boxed haya-zushi to go, eating at the stalls not yet being offered as an option at this point. This phenomenon was also accompanied by the emergence of the mobile sushi vendor, with a novel from 1770 describing how flashily dressed young men would regularly roam the Yoshiwara Pleasure District, carrying stacks of boxed sushi and advertising their wares in a loud voice. By this point in history, the city of Edo was home to a staggering number of rice polishing facilities, and the residents of the city had come to almost exclusively eat white rice as opposed to the brown rice or mixed grains that their ancestors had survived on. While this did bring about some chronic health problems as the result of white rice's comparative lack of nutrients, it certainly can't be left out of the discussion when explaining the rapid evolution that sushi, as well as its sale and consumption, experienced during the middle of the Edo period. The late 1700s were a particularly explosive period of evolution for the Japanese culinary scene, thanks to the policies of the Tokugawa shogunate under the leadership of Chamberlain Tanuma Okitsugu, with currency reform and the encouragement of commercial guilds leading to a booming economy and a significant rise in consumption. The stimulated economy brought forth a heightened interest in food and cuisine, and we begin to see books like the Tofu Hyakuchin, which present readers with 100 ways to prepare a single ingredient, in this case tofu. Sushi, by this point, had come to be regarded simply as a slightly tart food involving rice and fish, and as long as that loose definition was met, pretty much anything was fair game, opening the door for a lot of creative freedom in the kitchen. It was in this cultural environment that the first examples of what is now probably the most popular style of sushi in many Western countries, maki-zushi, began to take the stage. One of the downsides of old-fashioned sushi was that it was made in this large pail or bucket, which served as the container in which it was fermented and pressed, as we saw in the example of funazushi. However, with fermentation having been largely cut out of the sushi-making process by the late 1700s, it naturally followed that people would also explore ways to press the sushi without having to use a massive, difficult-to-wash container. In the case of box sushi, it was by this point usually just being pressed in the actual box that it would later be sold in. But in the case of sugata-zushi, or form sushi, the pressing was starting to be carried out with a small bamboo mat known as a makisu, a tool I'm sure many sushi lovers out there are quite familiar with. Maki-zushi is thought to have evolved out of this way of pressing form sushi, with the fish's head and tail eventually being removed and the sushi being cut into slices to create something called bo-zushi. Bo-zushi then came to frequently be wrapped in a bamboo leaf before being pressed with the makisu, the leaf here just serving as a non-edible wrapper. And eventually, some adventurous chefs began experimenting with other materials they could wrap the sushi in prior to pressing it. A recipe for maki-zushi from a 1776 cookbook uses nori seaweed, just as most restaurants do today, but it also informs the reader that they can replace the seaweed with blowfish skin or even thin paper, with the paper again just being a wrapper similar to the aforementioned bamboo grass. Once we enter the 1800s, these non-edible sushi wrappers phase out, but we do see a number of interesting edible variations pop up in addition to the standard nori, such as soft wakame seaweed or a layer of Japanese-style scrambled egg called tamagoyaki. The main inner ingredient for maki-zushi during the late Edo period was kampyo, strips of dried gourd which have been simmered in a sweet and savory sauce, and it continues to be regarded as the quintessential norimaki filling in many traditional sushi restaurants today. By the way, the reason that so much maki-zushi in Western countries has the rice on the outside of the roll is because the first few generations of Western diners to try the food were apparently not super fond of the idea of eating seaweed, and so sushi chefs compensated for this by essentially hiding the seaweed deeper within the sushi roll. Even today, it's a style of maki-zushi that is rather difficult to find if you are actually in the country of Japan, despite its massive popularity in the West. While the invention of maki-zushi was a momentous occasion in the history of sushi, it was neither its final nor its most pivotal transformation, as that honor is reserved for the style of sushi most ubiquitous in Japan today, Nigiri-zushi. For those unaware, Nigiri-zushi is a style of bite-sized sushi which is formed by firmly gripping the sushi together with one's hands, the gripping process essentially being the final evolution of the stone weights we saw used in earlier varieties of sushi. The word nigiri actually comes from the Japanese verb nigiru, meaning to grip, and in Japanese this word is typically used in place of the word make when talking about making sushi. In other words, sushi is not made, it is gripped. The most mainstream theory for the genesis of Nigiri-zushi is that it was the brainchild of a man named Hanaya Yohei, who invented it in 1824 at his sushi shop, Yohei Sushi, which he had opened after changing trades several times and failing in business endeavors as a tool salesman and the owner of a dessert shop. Suspiciously, however, most mentions of Hanaya Yohei as the father of Nigiri-zushi come from records from the Meiji period in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the more scant Edo period records indicate that he may have actually just jumped on an already emerging trend and found success with it. Hanaya Yohei's grandson recalled that the sushi which was initially popular during his grandfather's era was box sushi, with the sushi within the box essentially being pieces of nigiri-zushi that had been divided up with leaves of bamboo grass and pressed for a number of hours with a stone weight. Hanaya Yohei felt that while this long pressing process made the sushi last longer, it degraded its flavor, and so he developed a version where the sushi was simply pressed by hand rather than with the stone weight, and customers could eat the sushi as soon as he was done assembling it. In this sense, Hanaya Yohei was not so much the inventor of nigiri-zushi as he was an innovator who greatly improved it. In these last decades of the Edo period, life had grown particularly hard out in the farming villages of the provinces, and as such there was a growing influx of young men to the city of Edo in search of work. Japan's currency economy was well developed by this point, and so many of these young bachelors lived a lifestyle of working hard for currency wages and then going out in the evenings to spend those wages at restaurants and food stalls. While some sushi shops were taking a fancier fine dining route, most of them were low-priced street food style establishments aiming to secure their customer base among these working class folk. And it was in this environment, prioritizing speed and affordability, that Hanaya Yohei developed his take on nigiri-zushi. The actual first recorded mention of nigiri-zushi is in an 1827 anthology of senryu poetry, in which a poem humorously compares the hand movements of a sushi chef making this new type of sushi to the hand movements of a ninjutsu practitioner. Almost hand in hand with the arrival of nigiri-zushi, shops offering customers a stand-and-eat experience also began to emerge. Prior to this, most sushi shops sold sushi to be purchased either for takeout, delivery, or packaged as a gift, and the few that offered a dine-in experience were of the more pricey variety. So the birth of a kind of sushi which was made and eaten on the spot was easily one of, if not the biggest revolution in the history of the food. According to Morisada's Sketches, a comprehensive book of Edo culture and customs compiled during the last few decades of the Edo period, some of the toppings generally used in early nigiri-zushi were tamagoyaki, prawns, shirauo aka ice fish, gizzard shad, boiled conger eel, and tuna sashimi, which had actually been regarded as a low-quality fish for much of the Edo period, but began to rise in popularity thanks to its use in nigiri-zushi. Wasabi was apparently only applied to the tuna and the gizzard shad, not being used at all in other types. With the exception of the tuna sashimi, every single one of these ingredients was cooked or seasoned in some way or another, typically being either boiled, salt-cured, treated with vinegar, or being hit with some combination of the three. Because of this, soy sauce was seen by chefs and connoisseurs as not really being necessary, although this apparently did not stop many customers from applying it anyway. The reason wasabi was likely added to the tuna sashimi is that it has antimicrobial properties that kill bacteria, and while the denizens of Edo probably didn't know exactly what the wasabi was doing, they were aware that it decreased the chances of getting food poisoning after eating raw fish. In this age before the advent of easy refrigeration, it was of course necessary to acquire one's fish roughly in the same area that it was going to be consumed. And in the case of Edo, this was none other than the body of water we know today as Tokyo Bay. On the signboards or menus of many modern sushi shops, one often sees the phrase Edo Mai, but this phrase, which literally translates to "in front of Edo," is a throwback to the Edo period when all the fish used in the city's sushi was caught in Tokyo Bay, aka the bay in front of the city. The phrase eventually came to be used to denote Edo-style sushi, or in other words, nigiri-zushi, and when nigiri-zushi went on to effectively take over the sushi world, the phrase edomai became equally ubiquitous. As mentioned a moment ago, nigiri-zushi was originally the sort of affordable food that one would purchase at an outdoor food stall. The sushi chef would make the sushi beforehand and set it out on a shelf, and customers would then come up and select and pay for pieces that they wished to eat. Humorously, the style of modern sushi shop that most resembles this original way of purchasing and consuming the food is none other than kaiten-zushi, aka rotating sushi. The restaurants where pre-made sushi travels around on a conveyor belt and customers simply pluck off and eat the sushi which they find appealing. While these restaurants are often trip destinations for foreign tourists, in Japan they are generally regarded as being low-end sushi, cheap and not particularly high quality. So it is ironic that they closest resemble nigiri-zushi in its original form. Of course, the obvious disadvantage of this original style, and one which kaiten sushi restaurants undoubtedly deal with in the modern day, is that some sushi is bound to never be chosen and thus go to waste. It was from a desire to minimize this waste that sushi shops likely evolved into the made-to-order style that has become the standard at most sushi bars today. Speaking of sushi bars, the idea of sitting at a counter in a restaurant and ordering your sushi directly from the chef is thought to have originated from the more upscale sushi restaurants of the 19th century, who instituted the idea as a means of recreating the more popular food stall experience. As the decades went on, though, and people became more conscious of things like food hygiene issues, outdoor sushi stalls gradually phased out of existence, and sushi as a sit-in dining experience survived to inherit the throne of the sushi world. Nigiri-zushi was very much an Edo food and a piece of Edo culture, but when Edo became Tokyo and the official capital of the country at the dawn of the Meiji period, the government pursued a policy of Tokyoifying the whole country. Thus, just as Tokyo dialect Japanese gradually became regarded as standard Japanese, nigiri-zushi too slowly came to be seen as the prominent style of sushi in the country, reigning over the other styles popular in different regions. However, much as is the case today, many of the residents of Tokyo were not necessarily born and raised in the city, having come from other areas in search of work and a new life. The tumultuous events of the early 20th century, such as the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 or the bombing raids carried out on Tokyo during World War II, were major catalysts in driving many of these people to return to their original home regions, and in the process, Tokyo sushi, which is to say nigiri-zushi, gradually spread throughout the country. What truly pushed it into the mainstream across Japan, though, was, ironically, Japan's defeat in World War II. In 1947, a law called the Emergency Restaurant Business Measures Ordinance was passed, which forced closed all food service establishments, excluding cafes. The country was, after all, in the midst of a serious food shortage and being forced to rely on food relief from the United States, so allowing restaurants to continue happily serving fancy meals to the few people who could afford them didn't really seem appropriate at the time. In response to the ordinance, however, Tokyo's Sushi Merchant Union lobbied the government into permitting them to carry out a peculiar style of transaction with their customers that let them skirt the rules and continue to do business. The transaction was as follows. A customer would show up to a sushi establishment with their own serving of rice in hand that they had brought from home, and they would then trade this to the restaurant for an order of nigiri-zushi. They would, of course, pay money as well, but the money was accepted by the sushi shop not as a food bill, but rather as a processing fee for converting the rice into sushi. In other words, the shop was not operating as a restaurant, it was operating as a commissioned manufacturer, and this brilliantly clever loophole allowed sushi shops to keep doing business even while the rest of the food service industry was in hibernation. These shops typically served customers with a 10-piece order of sushi, consisting of 8 nigiri-zushi and 2 slices of maki-zushi, a policy which ended up setting the standard for what is seen as a single-person serving today. This was also the period when the size of nigiri-zushi was apparently standardized to the bite-sized proportions most modern people are familiar with, as older variants are recorded as having been too large to eat in a single bite. The Emergency Restaurant Business Measures Ordinance was greatly relaxed after a couple of years, but that brief period of undisputed dominance had been enough to give Tokyo-style nigiri-zushi a lasting foothold in food service markets throughout Japan. Of course, these days, sushi has gone far beyond just being a food appreciated within the country of Japan, having spread across the planet to become a globally popular dish. Sushi made its way abroad for the first time during the Meiji period, when many Japanese left Japan to seek greener pastures in other nations. One of the first great destinations for Japanese immigration in the United States was Los Angeles, which was home to only about 200 Japanese immigrants in the year 1900, but by 1920 had come to host around 15,000. It was in those interim years that LA's Little Tokyo came into being, and the first sushi restaurant there is said to have opened in 1906. For quite a while, these immigrant-run sushi restaurants mostly catered to other immigrants and their offspring, but around the 1970s, sushi finally started to enter America's mainstream culinary culture, being taken up by American media as a stylish and healthy meal option. The rising popularity of sushi in the US naturally led to the gradual creation of new and unique styles of sushi which didn't exist in Japan, with the most obvious example being, of course, the California roll, a style of sushi which holds a special place in my heart as being the first kind of sushi I ever tried back when I was probably 11 or 12. The California roll was then reverse imported into Japan, where many sushi chefs were initially resistant to adopting it, seeing it as something of an abomination, but it eventually took root and today it can be found in many restaurants in Japan, although it does not have nearly the level of popularity that it holds in the United States.
Sushi is a food that only seems to grow more popular with every passing year. I mean, when I first tried it back in the early 2000s, I still knew a lot of people who had never eaten it, even in the fairly cosmopolitan college town where I was raised. Fast forward to 2022, and I think I would honestly be kind of shocked if I were to meet someone who had never at least tried something like a California roll before. Even despite the massive success of Nigiri-zushi and maki-zushi on a global scale though, we shouldn't forget that the older forms of sushi do still exist, and many of them are actually in danger of disappearing. The food shortage which Japan experienced during and immediately after World War II put a massive damper on the ability of poor farming families to continue producing the time and resource-intensive styles of traditional narezushi. And the economic bounce back, which began in the 1950s, fostered a culture centered around an out with the old, in with the new attitude that wasn't super interested in resurrecting dusty pre-modern recipes. It wasn't until the 1970s, when Japan's economic growth at last began to hit a slump and consumption began to decline, that a movement sprang up across the country to revive and preserve old traditional culture. It's thanks to this societal attitude shift that many of Japan's traditional pre-modern foods have been saved for posterity, but there have undoubtedly been many more that did not survive long enough to be rescued. And with the aging population, yet more that are liable to become endangered once again. While searching for photos to use in this video, I came across an old blog post from 2011 in which the Japanese blogger recalled visiting the town of Minakami in Gunma Prefecture around the turn of the millennium, and how at that time there was only a single 80-year-old man in the town who was continuing to produce that area's traditional narezushi. As I make this video in 2022, it seems highly unlikely that that man is still out there preserving that recipe, so I can only hope that he managed to find a successor not long after our blogger visited him. Next time you're in Japan and feeling adventurous, why not try going off the beaten path and tracking down one of these ancient traditional styles of narezushi or namanare? I know it's certainly something I've added to my bucket list in the process of making this video. There are also plenty of other, more accessible styles of sushi that I had to skip here for time constraints, so if you're a sushi lover looking for something a little different than the standard fare, you could also check out other popular styles like inari-zushi or chirashi-zushi, two more variants which developed alongside nigiri-zushi and maki-zushi during the Edo period. Anyway, I think I've rambled on long enough here, and I probably ought to get back to my little sushi set before it starts turning into some kind of weird, bastardized homemade namanare. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that little bell to get notifications whenever I put out a new Japanese history video. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and itadakimasu. Wait, no, that's not right.
不運を祈るぞ。